few words, and thank you for coming. I actually have met everybody here. Lynn did her undergraduate work at Fort Hays State, and she was an elementary education teacher originally. And because I was in the Air Force stationed in the East Coast, she decided she wanted to be an English teacher, and she completed that work at Syracuse University in Syracuse, New York. And after the Air Force, we started our life in Waco, Texas, way before Chip and Joanna Gaines went to Waco, Texas, and then went to Baylor Law School and became a practicing attorney. I graduated in 1975, and she practiced in Waco and Dallas. Prairie Bachelor is her third book, and generally speaking, she writes dealing with issues related to the Constitution. So my partner in life, Lynda Fenwick.
Well, he has thanked you for inviting us here, and I want to thank you, and I want to thank the people who are online listening and watching also, but especially to those of you who are made the effort to get in the car and come out tonight. And I hope I can share something new with you that you didn't know. I'm going to be talking to you about whom I call my Prairie Bachelor. I got very involved in Isaac Werner's life. And most of the time I'm going to be talking about once he came to Kansas. But I thought I would introduce a little bit about him before he got to Kansas. And he was born in Wernersville, Pennsylvania. And it's interesting that his name is Isaac Werner and the town is Wernersville. Well, that's because his father founded the town. His father had this plat drawn up on some land that he owned. And when the railroad wanted to go through his land, he said, that's fine, but you will need to refer to it as Wernersville. And it is still a functioning city in Pennsylvania. And as a matter of fact, we have met some of the family, one gentleman in person and others virtually. And they love the book and the story about Isaac, whom the family had forgotten. They love it so much that they are going to drive to Kansas in June, and we are going to show them some of the things that are mentioned in the book. I'm going to be doing a lot of this because that's how I signal Larry. Yeah, but he works so cheap. Yeah. He left Wernersville. He was a twin, and that might seem rather unusual. His twin brother stayed in Wernersville and made his life there. But Isaac had a little bit of that go west young man spirit, I guess, and he headed west. And he settled in Rossville, Illinois. He was a druggist. And I found this postcard online. And if you look very, very closely, you can make out DRUG on that flat roof that comes out over the entrance to what I believe was his drugstore. He was very successful. And during that period of time, he was making good money. And he spent a lot of it on books. The thing that was so impressive to me was his library. I love books, and I couldn't help it but fall in love with Isaac Werner. And so this is where he was for a while. I think that perhaps the changes that made him give up this business that was doing so well were possibly three things. One of the major things was a change in the law. A lot of the patent drugs that a druggist sold had a very high alcoholic content, and good people in town thought that that medicine was very good for them. But the law changed, and he had to keep a ledger out on his counter, and whenever someone bought something, he had to enter that in the ledger, and he was concerned about how some of his customers would feel about their names in there showing up to buy medicine quite as often as they were. Another thing was that the railroad came to Wernersville, came to his drugstore area. He thought it would cut into his business because there would be more people, more stores, and maybe his business wouldn't be as active. A third reason is that he wrote in his journal, the early part of his journal, he wrote about he loved the idea of cameras. And you know, the stereoscopes that are two pictures, have you ever seen those? They go on a rack and they were just slightly angled differently. And as you slide them up to look at them, it gets a 3D impression. He thought that would be wonderful, that he could take pictures and sell them to people at programs and gatherings. But what he really wanted to do was photograph the prairie before it was ruined. So he was not excited about the changes that were coming with more people coming across. What I know is, and I learned one of these things, is that he did become a photographer. A couple of years after, during the period after he had sold his drugstore, he was a photographer in that town. And the other thing that I always knew about and is in the book is that he was in a partnership in a milling business. But he came to Kansas in about 1877. And that's when he arrived on the prairie. I found this ledger. That is his journal. It's 480 pages. It's the size, the oversized journals that you would find at the courthouse. He wrote densely. His penmanship is fine, but some of the way that they wrote, you know, the kids today are only taught how to print.
Mhm.
And there's this big question about whether they'll ever be able to read family things that are cursive. I didn't have that problem. I can't imagine that the cursive is so different from the printing that they are being taught today that they won't be able to read their ancestors' letters and those sorts of things. But he did write with slightly different style in his script. And he practically wrote from the binding to the edge of the page. And so it was a little bit difficult to read. He left the outside edge so that he could create a sort of index, maybe planted corn, first freeze. A lot of it having to do with farming, but not all. He could write about when he went into town, what he saw in town. So it was a little bit helpful to me. I transcribed the 480 pages. It took me almost an entire year, a new set of glasses, and a new laptop. That was a lot of typing. And the other thing that I did while I was copying it, every time I came to a person, I went online and I researched that person. So all of his neighbors and everyone that he wrote about did not enter into the book, but a lot of them did. And I did not want to put anything, I researched as if I were writing an academic text. But academics already know about the populist movement. I wanted ordinary people to know about the populist. How many of you have heard of the populist movement? Percentage-wise, you're one of the highest groups. A lot of people have never heard of it until they read my book. And that's what I wanted to do. And I knew that if it were written like an academic book, despite the bibliography and the footnotes at the back, I wanted people to feel like they were picking up a novel. And I wanted them to fall in love with Isaac Werner so that they would keep reading. That, if you read it, I don't even mention a bird or a plant if I didn't research and make sure that that bird or plant actually existed on the Kansas prairie where he lived. So I worked very hard to make it as accurate as if I were writing an academic book, but to write it in such a way that you read it as if it were a novel. The books behind, I told you, he bought lots of books when he was a druggist and had the money to do that. He continued to do that, but not at the pace because he didn't have the same income. But I wanted to get a sense of who Isaac was and what he was reading. And so all of these books behind the journal are titles that he owned. And when he would mention a book that he had bought or a crate of books that he had bought, and he identified what they were, I would go online. I didn't buy all of his library, but I would go online and I would try to find that book in a volume with the printing at about the same time he would have been buying the book. And this just gives you some idea. His, when they did his, after his death, and they had the sale, selling things, he still had over 400 books in the library. And by then he had given away a great many of them. Some of them were just sold in lots in boxes. He had the library of a learned man. He was a learned man. He was an autodidact. He never stopped learning and studying. I wanted you to see, Isaac Werner was in Stafford County. He staked a homestead claim and a timber claim. A homestead claim, you had to live on it, make improvements, actually have some sort of a residence and stay there 5 years. They did not want people coming to the prairie, staking a claim, doing the paperwork, and then heading back east where it wasn't rough living. They wanted to populate the prairie. And so that was what the Homestead Act was all about. And he was there, and I'm going to tell you about another gentleman. And I want to see if I'm on the right page. Yes, there was another gentleman I'm going to talk to you about today. And his name is John Rankin Rogers, and he is mentioned in my book. He came at about the same time, but when he came, the land here had been already settled pretty densely in terms of the things that were available to claim the way that Isaac claimed. They'd pretty much been taken up, and I am relying on a book that I got by going through your library collection online and finding a book that gave me that information. Isaac knew he was going to be a farmer. He was a literate man. That's what he was going to do, however, not open another pharmacy or anything like that. The gentleman who came and settled in Harvey County became a newspaper editor. They had much in common. Both had begun careers as druggists. Both had great respect for education. Both would become active in the Farmers Alliance and later in the People's Party. And eventually, when John Rankin Rogers became an editor for the Kansas Commoner, a newspaper in Wichita, Isaac Beckley Werner would be published in that newspaper, and the two men would become correspondents. John Rogers lived in Harvey County, Kansas, between 1876 to 1890, while Isaac Werner arrived in Stafford County, Kansas, in about 1877 and remained there until his death in 1895. People came on foot, by wagon, and as well by train. So the earliest ones couldn't get on a train. They got there how they could. But as the railroads moved across the land, they wanted people to show up. They needed customers, whether they were passengers or whether they were shipping their produce, they needed customers. And so nobody exaggerated what was waiting for you in Kansas any more than the railroad bulletins, the railroad posters. And that was what attracted a lot of people. Many of the people who came to this community and this county were immigrants from Pennsylvania and Germany. I don't know whether you knew that or not, but Isaac Werner came from a German community and would have felt right at home if he would have settled here. He came too late, really, to find any land here. I've already told you his hometown was founded by his father, but he settled in Kansas in Stafford County, claiming both a homestead and a timber claim. By January of 1872, even before the arrival of John Rogers, all unoccupied government land, quote, of any value, close quote, already had a filing on it, according to, quote, the short stories of Harvey County. And I think your library probably has that. Further west, there were still claims available, and Isaac took one of those. When I started writing the book, I knew I wanted to write about the populist movement, but what was important to me was to lay the groundwork. Why did these farmers, miners, small town businessmen, why did they think that they needed their own political party? And I wanted to do that sequentially. I wanted to lead up to it, why they wanted one, and then tell about how they got it, and then how it worked, and then what happened. So I wanted to structure it in that way, and I needed to be able to tell you what was coming when you started reading. If you said, well, shoot, this doesn't talk about the populist movement. And so what I did was begin at the end. I began the book with Isaac's death, and I want to read to you that particular section. Late March was a busy time of year for farmers in 1895, yet the group of prairie homesteaders, the men dressed in canvas trousers and denim overalls and the women in calico, would surely have left their work long enough to gather around an open grave in Neyland Cemetery to pay their final respects to Isaac. In earlier years, the group of mourners would have been larger, but Isaac had been ill for so long that when death finally came for him, he must have been a forgotten man to many people in his community. Once he had been a familiar figure at the Farmers Alliance meetings, stepping to the podium to condemn the greed of Wall Street and monopolies, and to urge farmers to recognize that their best hope depended on joining together politically and economically. Some members of the Farmers Alliance may have noticed his absence and assumed Isaac had finally left to join the farming cooperatives in Mexico. And he spoke often of them at meetings. At the District 33 schoolhouse, the privies needed painting and repairs to the roof had been neglected for months, but only the parents of older students would have remembered the bachelor who believed so strongly in educating both children and adults that he regularly took it upon himself to keep the schoolhouse tidy, as he called it. Now, Isaac became too ill to pick up a paintbrush or a hammer, and the little tasks of keeping the building in good repair had often been ignored until they became big jobs. His solitary caretaking was missed, even when the man himself was not. The cluster of old friends and close neighbors would have been only the remnants of the many acquaintances from his past. Those special friends and neighbors who believed Isaac was deserving of half a day's loss of plowing and planting their fields and gardens. News at the time for the funeral would have been passed by word of mouth, but all of his friends knew where to gather. Isaac had told those who cared for him in the miserable final months of his life, when he was humiliated by the need for help, that only those personal matters a man would never want help doing required, that he wanted to be laid to rest in Neylands, where so many other homesteaders in his Kansas Prairie community had already been buried. His gravestone was simple, suitable for a man who served his community without expectations of reward and who celebrated achievements and birthdays privately. The inscription read, I. B. Werner, died March 21, 1895, aged 51 years. Senator William Pepper was one of the first successes of the populist movement.
Sorry, I'm just talking back and forth. Sorry. Okay, here we go. There we go.
Settlers arrived optimistic about crop prices received by those who were the earliest settlers in Kansas. What would you do if you came to a new place, new land, not knowing anything about the weather? So they talked to the people that had been there before, and they were told what was grown, what they got for their crops. And so the newcomers went to the bank and they had calculated, with that price, I can pay off my loan in a year or two. Well, what happens when there are more people raising crops? They're raising the same crops, the prices go down. And what happens when you go to the bank and other people who borrowed money defaulted and didn't pay, and the bank needs to do something to survive? And so what did they do? They raised the interest rates. So they worked completely opposite. And that is what William Pepper is writing about, and I quote from him. The average net return on Kansas farms was only about 1% of their value, and that value was low and declining. If the farms of the state were put up for sale, they would not bring half the amount of the mortgages on them. Stated differently by Pepper, if a farmer had given a mortgage for $1,100 in 1870, he could have paid it with 1,050 bushels of corn. 10 to 17 years later, it would have taken, without interest, 2,702 bushels to have paid it. And so that is what happened to the people who came trying to be conscientious about what they were doing, and everything just seemed to be working against them. So the first group that got organized and decided they would figure out some way to make this work was in Texas. And they formed what was called the Farmers Alliance. It was not a political party. It was simply an organization. You could be Republican, you could be Democrat, you could have no interest whatsoever in politics. And but you could come together and you could talk about how you succeeded and where you failed and what were good ideas and what were bad ideas. And you could help one another. You could maybe come together, and if you didn't have a plow but you had a horse, you would work it out. And you can see on the flag what their goals were. The most good for the most people, wisdom, justice, and moderation, free trade. They believed in free trade. And this was the beginning of the Farmers Alliance, 1878. Yeah, go to the next one. Okay. I need to get something up. When I found this political cartoon in a newspaper, I was quite surprised. This was mine when I was a little girl. And it is exactly what that political cartoon from the late 1800s is using as an example. And if you look at it, the plutocrat and his toy, the plutocrat and his toy, And then on the little sign hanging off of the monkey's tail is the Metropolitan Press. And if you look at the plutocrat, he has the $sign on an ornament for his tie, and he's dressed very well. And look who is controlling the Metropolitan Press. Not the people, but the plutocrats. And this was the big thing that the populists were unhappy about. They felt like the Farmers Alliance was to bring them together to try to confront the power of wealthy people. Isaac was among the first members of his rural community and was elected as an officer. And John Rogers was an organizer of the Farmers Alliance in his community. So they had that in common. It was a non-political organization, and Republicans, Democrats, and people who weren't particularly political came together. And Isaac also organized what was called the County Agricultural Society. And its purpose also was to get farmers together. Also, about half of their membership were people that were merchants in the town. But of course, the merchants wanted the farmers to succeed, or they didn't have anybody coming to their stores. And so Isaac not only was active in the Farmers Alliance, but also in this county agricultural society. John Rogers and Isaac Warner both were founders in their community. Newspapers were extremely important to the success of the whole idea of a populist party. And to give you an idea of just how important populist newspapers were, I want to read a passage from a book titled The Great Revolt and Its Leaders. It was written by a man named Carlton Beals. It was published in 1963, and Carlton Beals was the son of a publisher in Kansas, a publisher of a Kansas newspaper in Medicine Lodge, if you know where Medicine Lodge is. And he wrote many books prior to this one, and he was a well-known author in his time, although I had never heard of him until I was doing research for this. But I want you to listen closely to what was said about the populists when he was writing after his father, a generation after the active time of the populist movement. And then think about today as I'm reading to you. One of the basic tenets of populism was that men first had to be informed before they could accomplish anything important. They started 100 newspapers. They distributed millions of pamphlets and books. They engraved their messages on the brains of millions. Today, even that has become more difficult for honest men. The matter has been made more complicated. Knowledge itself has become more institutionalized, more controlled, though words and paper have become cheaper and more widely disseminated. Who controls the knowledge has become a more pertinent question than knowledge itself, so far as national and international survival are concerned, so far as political and social progress are concerned. So each generation has its issue about getting the news and getting accurate news. I'm going to talk to you now about delegates that went to the, Kansas was the first state to form a state People's Party, and they named it the People's Party. Nebraska also was interested in having their own party. And they did have their own party. It didn't gain ground in the same way that Kansas did. But all these other states that were primarily, the South was just so crippled because the Civil War, they didn't have any banks to go to borrow the money. They were really in desperate condition. And of course, the farmers on the plains were just covered up in debt. And so they came up with the idea in Kansas and were so successful that the other states, similar farming states, said, let's make a national party. And so this picture is of the national gathering. It happened to be that year in Nebraska. And their very first year as a nationwide political party, they elected 5 US senators, 10 US representatives, 3 state governors, and about 15,000 state and county officials in its first year as a national party. Now that's impressive. What we have a tendency to think of is we think of third parties as spoilers. A lot of times they will pull votes away from one of the established parties, and the other party then gets the benefit of them pulling them away. But the People's Party actually elected this list of successful candidates in their very first year. The thing that I think is particularly fun about this picture, these were people that their peers, their community, chose to send to the convention. And I'm guessing they were the most respected, trustworthy men in the populist movement in their community. And I bet they have on their best to go to the convention. And their best isn't too fancy, but it was their best. Okay. Now I'm going to return to your local county person. In the same year of 1890, when Kansas farmers, ranchers, and small town merchants formed their own state political party, John Rogers left Kansas to make his home in Washington state. There, he resumed his old business as a druggist, one thing that he and Isaac had in common, while continuing his political affiliation as a populist, the other thing that he and Isaac had in common. In 1895, John Rogers was elected to the Washington State House of Representatives as a populist. And the following year, he became the governor of Washington. The memory of John Rogers is not forgotten in Washington state. How many of you had heard of John Rogers? He's from your county. He was a big deal. So now you know. And I said, don't mention anything about him because I want to have a surprise for the people who come or watch. And so that is my surprise, that this forgotten man was a big deal in his time. And you can see this is a school named after him in Washington state. And it is one of 2 schools named after him. I'm going to talk about the legacy of both Isaac Werner and John R. Rogers. When I found Isaac Werner's 480-page journal in a dusty box in the basement of the Lucille M. Hall Museum in St. John, Kansas, he was a forgotten man. I knew there was a journal that had been kept by a homesteader, but Lucille Hall had owned. Isaac went to live with her grandparents when he became too ill to care for himself. And I believe probably the journal went with him. And then when he was moved to another family for care, I think the journal stayed with the Hall family. And I think that's how it came into Lucille's hands. But she founded a museum, and I found it in a box in the basement of that museum. But Lucille saved all kinds of things. And that I don't know how long that box would have been in that basement before anybody ever opened it. But when I asked about it, they said, we have no idea what you're talking about, but you're welcome to go down in the basement and just look wherever you want to look. And that's how I found the journal. I didn't actually be the one to pull it out of the box. I started in a closet and I worked in a small area so I could have some organization. And I went shelf by shelf, box by box. And I was to the last box and somebody came in and said, we're going home, but you're welcome to stay. Let us show you the switches. Now, these are the switches that you should not touch. And these are the switches that you should turn off. And this is how you lock the door. And I said, I'm just going with you. I don't think I want to touch anything and set off alarms. And I got a phone call the next morning, and you know how people are. Lynn was in that closet all day long. I wonder what she did in there. And somebody opened that last box that I think I might have opened the lid on. And that's where the journal was found. John Rogers was not a forgotten man, as I've just shown you with the school building named after him. And he has a statue, and that's the one that I've taken the picture, included the picture of, in Sylvester Park, Olympia. Having told you all about this former neighbor of maybe some of your ancestors, I need to tell you something more. In today's time and age, he has a wonderful reputation for all of the good things that he did, but America is America right now, and that's the part I'm going to tell you about. William Allen White's novella, A Most Lamentable Comedy, criticized the populist movement, saying the world would not be made better by a movement too weak to conquer its own bigotry. Now, what was true was that the populists didn't think much of the wealthy people. They thought the distribution of money available to the laborers, the farmers, the miners, the small businessmen, that after the Civil War, that whole thing had shifted so much. And there were these incredibly rich people, usually in East Coast cities, living like kings, literally. And then there were people starving on the prairie. And that's what they were all about. And they were very, very critical of the wealthy people, including wealthy bankers. Now, the whole thing about the populist movement was international. And so it included bankers in Europe and specifically in England. And many of the time, those bankers, I want to find where I'm supposed to be here. Many of the time, those bankers were Jewish. And there was criticism of the Jewish bankers. But I have not researched this as thoroughly as one of the Kansas authors that you may have heard of. And he really, really looked into it. And he said what he found was the newspapers, not the populist newspapers, the other newspapers were more critical than the populists were. In fact, the populists included Black farmers in their movement. They were more inclusive than some of the wealthy people running things on that strata. And I think I'm quoting from Thomas Frank. I don't know whether you're familiar with him or not. And I'm quoting from his book, The People Know. And this is where he said he found more examples of it. The populists were not, he agreed, enlightened racial liberals by modern standards today. But many of them were indeed, in fact, racist and anti-Semites, but not in their literature, not when it came to the material of the party itself. And he went through all kinds of material, populist material, and newspapers from the cities that were the wealthy people. And he says, on the contrary, Life magazine, a relentless adversary of populism, also gloried in publishing cruel stereotypes of Blacks and Jews. And so if you are sitting at home and thinking about what you heard tonight and you go, well, gee whiz, she didn't tell me that this man that had a statue had kind of a dark side. Well, now I have told you. And the work that I did not find anything that would have rebutted what I just read to you. That yes, they were critical of wealthy people, but they were not critical just because of your ethnicity. And in fact, in contrast, they did include the Black farmers, the Southern Black farmers who after the Civil War were trying to struggle a living out of that environment, just like they were in Kansas. And so I wanted to tell you that so it wouldn't come as a surprise to you if you got home and you said, this guy sounded really, really interesting. I didn't know he lived in this county, and you started doing some research. You will probably find some of the criticism today. And what they said was the people that were unhappy about having the statue in front of the building, they just want to move it inside. At least they weren't breaking it up into pieces, but they did want to move it inside. I have told you that Prairie Bachelor is about a particular era at the end of the 1800s. And I have told you about how I found the journal and how it allowed me to tell this story from the perspective of someone who actually lived it. And I think he was a wonderful observer. And here's someone that's read the book. You can see that he documented things. He got his idea for documenting things from Reverend Beecher. As I mentioned to you, Reverend Beecher was a minister in New York City. His sister was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. But he was a minister, and he also wrote newspaper columns. And Isaac Werner glued a newspaper column in the inside of his beautiful journal, obviously having great respect for what was in that. And what it said was, be a reporter. And I think that that's what Isaac was. And I think that's what helped me write an accurate history of the populist movement, what led up to it, and what happened to it in the end. In trying to figure out how to tell this story, I had some concern. And as I told you, I figured out how to tell readers what was coming by telling about his death and the various things that were relevant to him. But I had a problem whether or not I could really convince ordinary people that they cared enough about this guy nobody had ever heard of to continue reading. And I thought about a poem from Leaves of Grass that I had read, and it impressed me at the time. And so I went back and I found that poem, and I'll read it to you. It is at the front of the book. And it was what guided me to trust that Isaac Werner could be the hero of a story. This is from Leaves of Grass. When I read the book, the biography famous, and is this then, said I, what the author calls a man's life? And so will someone, when I am dead and gone, write my life? As if any man really knew aught of my life. Why, even I myself, I often think no little or nothing of my life. Only a few hints, a few diffused faint clues and indirections I seek for my own use to trace out here. Now that's what gave me the courage to tell the story of one unknown man. And now I'm going to close by reading the close of my book. I told you about the son of a newspaper man in Kansas during the Populist Movement. And I close with his words once again. Quote, all we can say is the Populists made a good fight while it lasted. They are an integral part of the history of our land. They changed the thought and the pattern of American life. We can still learn much from their methods and their ideas. Close quote. Isaac played his part in that fight, and the journal he kept is no longer a forgotten record of one man's life during those consequential years. Had Isaac reflected on the question in Whitman's poem, might he have asked, will someone, when I am dead and gone, write my life? Someone has. Do you have any questions? I'm glad to answer questions.
Yes, thank you. And also those of you watching on Facebook, you can type your questions in the chat and I will read them.
Great.
So I have a question. You talked about the thousands of local officials and so many people elected. Today we have, of course, the internet and all kinds of modern communication. How did they manage to assemble such a large movement among isolated rural people in such a short amount of time? It's really kind of mind-boggling.
Well, first of all, the newspapers.
Mhm.
And that's why the newspapers were so important. The other thing that surprised me in doing the research is the trains. Most of the major speakers and thinkers during that time traveled around, and Isaac heard a lot of them live. And they would come to the towns and they would go to the town hall or the park or whatever, and they would speak. And so that was a lot of it. The trains allowed the candidates to ride for free until the populists began to threaten. And so they stopped allowing the populist candidates to ride for free, but they still let the Republicans and the Democrats, unless the Democrats had fused with the populists, and then they couldn't ride for free either. So there was more communication, and that surprised me too, that you think of, I use the example, the wide open spaces in the Lonesome Prairie. Isaac had more neighbors than we do, a lot more neighbors, because they could claim a quarter of a section for a homestead, and they could claim another quarter of a section for a timber claim, which meant that they could claim half of a square mile. And so people all around Isaac were staking their claims. He had neighbors, he walked to neighbors' houses easily, they were just all around him. At one point, I called our county courthouse and found out how many people there were in our township now. And it's not very many, maybe 23. Do you think that might be about right, honey? And he would have had that many practically in shouting distance. So our picture of what it was like to be a homesteader needs to take into account that you had a lot of neighbors and they helped each other out. And one of the things they did was they worked together. Not everybody raised potatoes like Isaac did. And so if he needed somebody to help harvest the potatoes, they were not necessarily busy. So they were able, and then they also had a cooperative potato patch. They were playing with this cooperative stuff But they weren't thinking about it as some kind of big social movement. They just thought maybe if we work together, we can diversify a little bit. We can get our potatoes planted more quickly and a better time for good growth. That they did communicate more than you might think, but I think the best answer to your question is the newspapers.
Mhm.
And they also had these organizations, even before, I talked about the organization that was not political. They met. They did not meet so much during planting season and harvesting seasons, but during the winter months, that was when they could get together and they didn't have so much they needed to be doing at home and they could take an evening off. So word of mouth, newspapers.
And they elected people to attend higher level organizations. Information came back.
See. On Facebook, Sarah asks, where is his original journal now? Is it in a library or the Historical Society in St. John?
It belongs to the Lucille M. Hall Museum. And that is, as I said, a lot of times these museums are created, but they run out of money to hire somebody to be there all the time. The museum there is not open all of the time, but they have a little thing. Right now, it's in my hands, but not mine.
Yeah. And then I'm curious, could you tell us a bit about his was it you said he was inspired by reporters. So is it kind of a dry factual, or did you write about his personal emotions and kind of diary type stuff as well? Or
when he was a young man in Rossville, Illinois, it was more like a diary. He noticed the pretty girls that came into his store, and he would go to outings, and he had one day off a week. The rest of the time, his store was open, and he had friends, and they'd go down to the creek and sit on a log, and he had a cousin that came and played the squeeze box or accordion. Yeah. So he had a social life, and that was how he occupied his time. Some of the time it wasn't even isolated in Kansas either. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure it did.
yeah.
I'd like to follow up on his question a little bit. So this great big book with all these thousands of entries, are there emotional things in there, or is it mostly factual things of what's happening or what's going on with the neighbors or
I knew
my issues?
I knew I didn't finish answering your question. In the beginning, when he was the young druggist in Rossville, Illinois, it was more like a diary. It was what he was doing, what he was inventing. He was a very inventive person. People that came in, what they did when they walked down to the creek, comments about other, there was a pretty lady that was the young lady who was the first bookkeeper in Rossville, and he kind of had his eye on her, and he was writing about that. And then the proprietor who had hired her let her know that as she started dating, she would no longer be the bookkeeper. So there were that kind of chatty, personal, diary-like things in that part. I believe that he found the clipping that I told you about, Reverend Beecher's clipping, which said, observe what you see. If you have a conversation with a learned man, write about that. Always record the weather. That was Reverend Beecher. You turn the television on and find out what the weather was forecast for. You could write it down and flip back and see a year ago how cold it was or something like that. But that was one of the things. But Reverend Beecher advised being an observer to document what was going on in your community, more like a reporter, not like a diarist chit-chatting about his life. And I think that because there was that 14-year break that he wasn't writing. And when he picked back up, he was writing in the style that Reverend Beecher had described. And it was, and I was so glad, in terms of writing a book about the populist movement, the second part of the journal was the best. In terms of getting to know Isaac, I'm very glad that I had that first part where he talked about himself and what he liked and what he didn't like, and helped me get to know him as a personality better than if the whole journal would have been like the latter part, which is the better research material.
Was he successful as a farmer?
He was not in debt. He had loaned money to people, and after his death, they collected the money that had been loaned. So yes, he was successful. His brother acquired title to the timber claim. That part of his story is hard for me to quite completely understand. He came out and he claimed the timber claim and the homestead. And when his father died, his twin brother was the one given the responsibility to keep all of that intact, not parcel it up and give it out to his children and his widow at the time of his death. And so somehow that money from his father's estate was handled by his twin brother. And after Isaac had matured the timber claim, title was transferred to his brother. Although he did all the work, and he continued to do all the work on the timber claim, which you had to, get rid of the sunflowers and stickers around the trees until they got up big enough. Fires were horrible on the prairie. It wasn't because somebody set them necessarily. Lightning strikes could do it. There weren't trees when they first got there. It was just prairie grass, and a lot of homes were sod homes. But he did all of the work the whole time, but he didn't own it anymore. But he did own his land, his claim, free and clear, and had money in the bank, and had people who owed him money. So I think you would call him a success. Yes.
I can't quite get the picture plain of the progression. He was back east, he had a store. And then there was a 14-year gap. He came out here. He died a relatively young man.
Yes.
How many fruitful years did he really have when he was real active? Because you said he was sick for quite a while at the end of that. My picture in my mind was there was a very short period of time when he could have been maybe physically and mentally really into things out here.
Well, he was really into things in his community. He was a speaker in many of those situations. He started the agricultural society in the county. He was very active in that time, and his illness was gradual. It wasn't like, I'm trying to think, he was incapacitated the last 2 years. But the clues go through what I figured out physically, medically, what killed him. And I say that for the end, but he was weakened by this, but he still worked. He was very active in his community. He did contribute a lot. He drew plans for people's houses. He built with 3 of them, one time 4th, the first wooden school structure in the community. He was I think I mentioned in the part that I read to you that he wanted it to be a welcoming thing. If he noticed that something was loose, he would take his hammer up and he would fix it so it didn't turn into a big problem. He was active and he was important in his community. Yes, he died young, but lots of people did.
He basically, from 1877 to 1891, for 14 years, he was perfecting the land. So in 14 years from homesteading it to making it productive. So he did have 14 years, but you're correct. He died so young, he really didn't have a chance to see it.
Well,
blossom.
he got on the prairie. You know, there was the gap between being a druggist and then he was still in that town for a while as a photographer and a part owner in a milling company. And then he went to Kansas and he did not resume writing in his journal immediately. He started writing in it, not quite, well, I think he got there in 1777 and he started, excuse me, 1877, and he started writing in his journal regularly in 1884. So there was a gap in there, but he referenced back. You know, when he was writing, he would say, I've planted down by the first dugout. And he referenced 2 dugouts opening up a field. So I know that when he first got to Kansas, he did not immediately have a wooden home. He had sod homes or dugouts, like a lot of people did. So even though his journal was not continuous from the time he got there until shortly before he died, I was able to be aware of what was going on because he referenced back.
So is there a trace of his house still there, or any farm buildings or things you could go and see and look at?
I know where his fields are.
Uh-huh.
I know where he's buried.
Mm-hmm.
The house where he was first cared for when he could not care for himself is still in existence. That happened to be my great-great-grandfather's house. And he was only there for about 2 weeks because of his illness. He lost muscle control in his hands and legs, and he could not care for himself. And so that was the kind of care that needed more than a lady doing. That would have been very embarrassing for everybody involved. And she had 4 children. So they kept him for a while because they were friends. And then another couple took him in. And a lot of his liquid wealth went to them because they had no problem, even though he had been very generous and good to them when he was well. They had no problem charging him a lot based on what other people were getting paid for their work. And they soaked up in the time that they had in a lot of his liquid wealth. And his land then was passed to his brother and sister, his surviving ones.
Sam, let me kind of close the book. Can you hold up the book, Sam?
Yeah, let me see. I'll hold it up and then people
Who might
can
be-
see it on the can they see it on the
Okay.
camera, and then
And that is the journal
that's the
on the
journal.
front cover.
Sorry.
They have a copy at the library. The book is
This is
sold
the
in
library.
Wichita at Watermark Bookstore.
Okay, I was about to ask where I could. purchase
Right,
the book.
and if anybody's interested, I want you to think this is high purchase sales. I did bring a few books. If you're interested, we could shortchange that thing and Lynn could sign if you're curious, but certainly that's a personal option. But the book was a 2021 notable book in the state of Kansas. And Lynn was so honored at the book festival at Washburn University and the book is doing very well in terms of the sales. But Lynn didn't get a chance to really talk about the first part of the story of a Kansas homesteader. For a lot of people, what they really enjoy reading is what it was really like to homestead this ground and develop it and perfect it and fight the bugs, the insects, the prairie fires, and really how difficult it was for all of these people who struggled in homesteading land in Kansas. And that's equally a part. And then that, because of that, the populist movement grew out of the problems that so many farmers were having, surviving. But in any event, we hope you enjoyed the evening, and we've enjoyed having you all come out.
I had to take time away from talking more about Isaac to share with you that you all have someone in this community, and he is mentioned in the book, that was a newspaper man that played a very important role. And I'll bet you didn't know you had someone from this community who went out to Washington State and became the governor. I thought you all would enjoy that link back to your own community. But I will be glad if you want to buy a book. If you're not sure, or you think you might want to buy more for gifts, I have book labels. And if you didn't bring any money tonight, you're going to buy later, I can sign a book label for you, and then you can put it in your book, because I thought that you might like to do that. So
What's the price of the book?
The on the internet, you can buy the book through University Press of Kansas or on Amazon, either way. Paperback is $26.95 plus sales tax. Tonight's special, $25 total. So if you want one, I can go get one. But again, I don't want anybody to feel pressured. And I know Jack already owns one. Yeah. he's
Yes,
from
yes, we
Hallstead.
do.
Okay.
My last name's Jack.
Let me go.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and sign off the live stream now. Thank you all for tuning in.
Not a problem.
Oh, I did see Sarah. Sarah had a question.
Yeah.
Maybe you could address it real quick.
Okay.
She asked, did the Kansas Populists support women's suffrage?
Yes, very strongly so. They voted on it, and the newspaper man in St. John did a little informal survey asking people, how are you going to vote for a woman?
Isaac was a big supporter.
I have an old brain. I love your questions, but don't interrupt me or I'll forget what I was even saying. What was I saying? The,
Newspaper.
Oh, they had a poll about whether people
okay,
supported
he
it.
was kind of polling his community. How are you going to vote? How are you going to vote? Nobody was going to vote for it. And they came very, in Isaac's county, it was successful. So yes, they did. The other thing that's interesting is he corresponded with Mary Elizabeth Lease, who was a big speaker for the populist movement. She lived in Wichita. She was an attorney, and he corresponded with her. And that's an important part of the book, because I did some digging and some research, and from his mentioning, I think I have accumulated some more information about her that wasn't known, and certainly wasn't known. Where the old library used to be in downtown by the round building in Wichita, there is a statue of Mary Elizabeth Lease. If you're ever in Wichita and you're curious to see her. But yes, in fact, he ordered a book to improve his speaking skills, because he thought he might want to become a speaker for women's suffrage. So yes, and the Populist Party was very welcome to women. Even though they didn't have the vote, they could be participants in that organization, both the Farmers Alliance and not getting to vote, but still being very active and becoming speakers. So yes, it was an extremely supportive organization for women.
The building is called Century 2.
Yes,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Oh.
The big round
That
building.
building.
Yeah, I know the statue you're talking about. All right, well, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and sign off the live stream now. So